This is the second half of the lecture looking at the Cold War divisions of Germany, specifically looking at the period between 1945 and 1949. We just looked at the situation in the Soviet zone and looking at some of the facts and the way that the Soviets were looking at that area that they were occupying. Historians have gone on to look at this, and there has been some revisionist views of this. One of the key things that's got to be noticed is that Stalin has had, should I say, consistently seen as being in East Germany as a possible overstretch. He wants to consolidate his gains as far as Poland and Hungary, but going into Germany potentially could lead to problems. And that is one of the reasons why he advised and also offered with the Western Allies to create a united Germany, but one that was neutral, that didn't take either the eastern or the western side. There is evidence of this. There is the perceived desire for a deal on Germany in 1945. There's the message to the KPD leaders, the German Communist Party, in June 1945 that Germany should remain united. There was breaks and separatist pressures from the East German leaders. There were national unity offers even as far as 1952, the so-called Stalin Notes. This is after the two countries have been created. Although, having said that, it could be seen as a way of trying to scupper the FRG integration into NATO, but more about that later. The French occupation zone, basically they were hoping for a dismemberment of Germany, especially in the Rhineland, and they'd be able to control the Ruhr. They opposed centralised institutions. They were non-signatories to Potsdam, therefore got very little say in what was actually decided there. They hoped for punitive reparations for German industry and forestry, and only later on joined the Anglo-American buy zone in 1948. More about that later. What about the British then? Remember, the Labour Party was in power in Britain at that time. The British alarm at the communist SPD merger in the Soviet zone, and this was seen as possible way of making sure the SPD were neutralised in their zone. In mid-1946, there was a sterling crisis. In other words, there were problems with the British currency, and therefore the occupation was becoming more and more a liability. We talk of, I'm sure you've heard of the phrase austerity. Well, austerity was very much in a situation in Britain in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Mainly because of the war situation. So Britain offered to merge their zone with America and France. America agreeing in January 1947, France a bit later on. Britain now seen as proactive and keen to encourage firm line with the Americans. Basically, Britain was hoping as much as possible that the Americans would take the lead. The Americans, on the other hand, basically said that there should be no fraternisation with the population, and it should be kept at a subsistence level, in other words, just given enough to survive. Although having said that, the situation changed very much as basically the Germans became part of the, not necessarily the bad guys as such, but very much part of what was going on in Germany between the Western Allies and the Soviets. Basically, the US was trying to halt the reparations deliveries to the Soviet zone, which obviously angered the Soviets. There's a speech given which pledges to Germany that they would be there for the long haul, which basically went against Stalin's wishes because he wanted a neutral Germany. This was basically sticking two fingers up at Stalin. Governor Clay blocks moves for the nationalisation of industry. Basically, again, it was a very contentious issue because of what was going on in the Eastern Zone, and various different historians have tried to look at it in terms of basically Americans possibly being one of the main reasons why the two country situation happens in 1949, that we don't get a united country, we get a divided country, and it's mainly because of US aggression. One of the key things that was agreed at Potsdam, if you remember, was what was known as denazification. And one of the ways that they dealt with this was what was called the Nuremberg Trials in 1946. This was a four-power agreement on the need to remove Nazis from the civil service, judiciary and education. 22 Nazi leaders were put on trial. 12 of them were condemned to death, although some of them took their own lives. Having said that, though, each of the, especially the Russians, Americans and British with the French, saw the trials as something different. For the Russians, they saw Nazism as an outgrowth of German capitalism and therefore needed to get rid, as much as possible, all aspects of Nazism. For the Americans, they wanted to remove the Nazis, but maintain the existing structure. In other words, keep the structures there that the Nazis had created, but move the people out to some degree. The British and French saw Nazism as inherent in the German national character. In other words, basically Nazism grew out of the German soul, if you like, and so they wanted re-education. Denazification ultimately was devolved to the German tribunals later on, and very little happened as a result. In terms of democratisation, this was a key driver of fractions between the East and the West. Basically, the old state of Prussia, which was basically the old Germany, was broken up. It no longer existed. Brandenburg, in a sense, replaced it. New Länder, or administrative areas, were created more or less mirroring the old German nations. Having said that, differences of approach again. A more centralised approach in the British zone. Unelected German officials made up the Central Economic Office and the Zonal Advisory Council. Municipal elections in autumn 1946, elections to state assemblies in 1947. The Americans were keen to introduce democracy as soon as possible, and elections held in 1946. By the beginning of 1947, power had been devolved to the Länder in the US zones. Having said that, the Russians established a central authority, the Soviet Military Administration of Germany, or SMAD, in July 1945, at the same time as governments in the Länder in their zone. So basically the Soviet military were in control. And you can see here how the different zones existed. Interestingly, there is a tiny little American part of the zone in the British section in Bremen, but remember the situation in Berlin as well. Well, what was the situation with the economy? It was useless. It was complete chaos. Major dislocation in the economy, as mentioned before. Food shortages, valueless currency led to a thriving black market. Ongoing disagreements over reparations. The Americans saw the revival of the German economy as a priority, whereas for the Russians, they wanted their reparations as soon as possible. July 1946, the USA suspends reparation deliveries to the Russian zone and offers an economic merger of the zones. Only the British agree, leading to the creation of a bi-zone in the 1st of January 1947. This angers the Russians, obviously, because they see the Western Allies ganging up, in a sense, against them. The French and the Soviets continue to extract reparations in kind. The Soviet zone brings in a radical program of nationalisation and land reform, as mentioned before. In the Western zones, insistence for the Americans that reconstruction reform be achieved within the framework of the free market, very much against what the Soviets were wanting. And here we have the different steps towards division. In the East, there was a merger of the SPD, the old Socialist Party, and the KBD to form the Socialist Unity Party of the SED, which basically becomes a party of government from 1949 through to 1990. The establishment of a bi-zone, as mentioned before, this is interpreted by the Russians as an attempt to create a separate hostile state to the USSR. There was a London Foreign Ministers Conference, which fails, mainly because the West Allies failed to convince the Russians they were trying to establish it, or it looked like they were trying to suggest that the communists were trying to create a puppet state. They determined to involve more powers than West Germany and integrate it into West Europe to provide a buffer zone against the spread of communism. Again, this angered the Soviets a great deal. There was another London conference in 1948, and this was only open to the Western Allies, deciding what to do about Germany, and again, this angered the Soviets. April 48, the Bizone included the Organisation for European Economic Cooperation, or OEEC, and this accepts martial aid. More about that later. In June 48, the Western powers announced their intention to convene a constituent assembly to draw up a constitution for a separate West German state. Basically, all roads are now leading towards a breakup of Germany into two, and the Constituent Assembly would be held by Germans themselves, and they would basically run it. One of the reasons for this was down to the American president at that time, Truman. This was the Truman Doctrine. Truman had been horrified at the pre-war Allied policy of appeasement and was determined to stand up to any Soviet intimidation. Basically, he saw that the USA would support free people who were resisting subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Basically, he said, well, we fought against the Nazis for freedom. We shouldn't let the Soviets stop that. Basically, this was a move against the isolations in the United States that they had for the best part of 100 years. As a result of that, the Marshall Plan was put into action. This was basically a European recovery programme set about by Secretary of State George Marshall. The US would provide aid to all European nations, including the Soviet Union, if they wished it. 12.5 billion of US aid to the US, Western Europe extended to Eastern Europe and the USSR, but this was, as I say, rejected. This reflected the strength of the US economy and offered huge sums to enable the war-shattered economies of Europe to rebuild, and by generating prosperity to reject the appeal of communism. Czechoslovakia showed interest in receiving Marshall aid, but was blocked by Russia. The Soviet system was as much dependent upon creating a self-contained economic bloc as it was in maintaining a repressive political system. Of course, it made sense to the Americans to do this because they gave the money to Germany and Britain and all these other places because they would buy American goods. You can see there that Britain was the greatest receiver of Marshall Plan payments. Germany was quite the way down, almost half. As a result of the new currency being introduced in the tri-zone of the French, British and American zones, this meant that the Eastern zone was now isolated, and this would destabilise the economy. So what they did was basically cut off West Berlin, and of course that meant very little could come in. The only way to bring things in was the Allies, the Western Allies, to bring in fuel through an airlift. This, interestingly enough, creates an attitude of us and them, not between the Allies and Germany, but by the West Germans with the Western Allies against the Soviet Union. And now, in some ways, the Western Germans are seen as the good guys. And you can see here how from the different zones we had to keep on flying in. Basically, one flight would land every 5 to 10 seconds, bringing in goods for the best part of 10 months. Berlin becomes a divided city, very much in the situation. The Berlin Wall hasn't gone up yet, and people could live in the east, for example, and work in the west, and travel across the dividing line very easily. But and people with money in the west could go and buy goods in the east pretty cheaply. But having said that, it becomes an espionage centre. You had to make sure, if you travelled to the east or the west, that you weren't going to be picked up by the various different organisations, security organisations, and be considered a spy. The Kudam, or the Fürstendamm, becomes a shop window for a better standard of living in the West, to show off what capitalism could do. You get, after the Parliamentary Council was established, they basically put together an idea of what became known as the Basic Law, and this became the West German Constitution. The West Germany basically becoming the FRG, the Federal Republic of Germany. Konrad Adenauer is elected the first Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany on the 15th of September 1949. In retaliation, in some ways, They didn't want to be left behind. The Soviets create the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, but here the SED, the Socialist Unity Party, basically takes over. Other parties are allowed, but